Hello and welcome to H-Poll's brand new show, Comps List Radio. We are very happy that you have joined us and are listening in. My name is Dr. Robert Ferguson. I'm here at the Center for American Institutions at Arizona State University, and I am a network editor at the prestigious H-Poll site. And I am joined by my co-host, Marie Totten, who is a visiting assistant professor at University of Central Arkansas. And she is a book review editor and also a network editor at H-Poll. Marie, are you able to tell the fine folks a little bit about yourself?
Yes, so like you said, thank you for the introduction. And I'm a visiting assistant professor at UCA in Central Arkansas, and I focus on political biographies. Arkansas politicians right now, segregationists specifically, but I look at political history through biography, which I think explains a lot about politicians and voters as well, and we can see a lot through that. Uh, and currently,
Well,
I
I think that the reason Marie, the reason we're doing this podcast, I think it's really important for us to talk about that, which is that we have recognized that there's a lot of books that are pretty old at this point, and but not out of date, still relevant, and it's getting harder and harder for the or for people to keep up as comps lists expand, and by virtue of just time and space constraints, they by nature have to privilege more modern books. However, those modern books are still sometimes having conversations with very old ones. And sometimes, debates and arguments fizzle out over the years. And so we want to make sure that people have an easy to approach um, avenue to be able to very quickly get an understanding of some of the older classic works of political history. And we know that if you're going through your comps right now, that you're busy reading constantly. And every time that you're away from a book, you feel guilty for being away from that book. I know I did when I was going through comps. And
absolutely.
Marie, I'm sure you did. And we both had kids when we were going through comps, so that we
Yes.
were looking after. So the reality was we couldn't be reading our books the entire time. And so for those of you who have to step away from reading for even just a few moments, Comps List Radio is here for you. If you have to go to the gym, if you got to drive your kids somewhere, we we can make sure that you are continuing to be productive
Absolutely.
while that's happening. And it's not just for, of course, for people going through comps. It's for people who are looking to rediscover these old classics and for a reminder as to why they're important. And some of these books maybe people have never read before.
Right.
So Marie, are you able to tell us a little bit about why we decided to do the book that we're doing today first, and maybe give a little bit of an introduction to this book?
Yes, so we're looking at the foundational Vann Woodward's Origins of the New South. This book, it's methodological, it's interpretive, it's this touchstone, not just in Southern history, but in political history. Any comprehensive exam about post-Reconstruction, especially in the South, about segregation's origins, about populism, about Southern progressivism, is going to require engaging with this text. He really sets the terms of debate for this period, this post-Reconstruction era in the American South. He also overturns the historiography that came before. And so we're just diving in with this foundation here right at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, and we're both Southern historians, so this is familiar terrain for us. We should be honest to people listening. Probably not everybody listening is a Southern historian. Many of the books that we talk about are not. Most of the books that we talk about are not going to be Southern histories, but we figured we would start with something that's a little bit familiar to both of us, and also one that it's the 75th anniversary of its publication this year.
Right.
So
No, that's
it's
wild too.
right. So I've got a question, Marie. Do you think there's a Southern history book that was published before this that's still relevant, or is this the earliest book that is still sort of that is still really important for Southern historians today?
I mean, I think this is where Southern historians today start. Before Woodward, you have the Dunning School, you have U.B. Phillips, who are talking about Civil War and Reconstruction. When he turns that on its head, we don't really consider those histories. I mean, Woodward shows us that's not accurate. That's extremely biased. That's lost cause history before he comes along. And the history of the South, or histories of the South, that he is part of, that this book is a part of this collection, he really is that first that we see using the evidence sources. Obviously, he's influenced by his time in the 1940s and 50s, and so I think for Southern history, this is where you start.
Yeah, I think it is. I think this is sort of the earliest book that that modern historians today would go back to
I
cite,
agree. I
right?
agree.
Now, I actually do think it might be fun in a later episode for us to actually dive into the Dunning School and for us to
There's an apple
actually.
now.
I think that might be a lot of fun. And however, as a place to begin, I think this is a really good place to begin for Southern history. Maybe the one exception earlier than this would be W.E.B. Du Bois's work.
Yes, yes, great point.
But
Great
that's
point.
almost a separate historiography. And but other than Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, I don't think there's an earlier book in Southern history, at least in postbellum Southern history, that is relevant to the discussion today. Okay, so Marie, can you tell us a little bit about C. Vann Woodward?
Yes, Stephen Woodward is such an interesting character. Not just during the time period, not just his work, but his actions in life kind of speak for themselves here. But he was born and raised in Arkansas, so exactly where I'm at. He graduated high school about 15 miles from where I'm teaching right now. And that really shaped his career going forward because he was a Southerner. He leaves the South. He stays in the South for part of his academic career. He eventually will leave the South, so he'll have that kind of inside outside look at Southern history. Vann Woodward was very young when he was asked to write this text, and I think his early 30s, maybe 30 years old. Not the first choice of the editors of this series, but I mean, what a different history we would have if he wasn't, the one that wrote about this era. So luckily, in the late 1930s, he's asked to write this next book in this series, and he starts it in the late 30s, and then 1941 happens, and he becomes a lieutenant in the U.S. Army, and so the book is put on hold for a while. And I think that it's better. It turns out better than it would have if he had finished this work in the early 40s or in the early 40s before the war, because he's able to bring in like the Dixie Crap movement is going to influence his work. He sees the South kind of returning to this almost. I mean, race war is a little strong, but he sees the South needing these answers about Reconstruction and needing to push back against the lost cause. And so he finally finishes this manuscript in 1950. There's some back and forth about it, but then it's going to be published in 51. And again, it's going to, explode on to the academic scene and of course, not everyone is Southern historians are not necessarily happy about this. But it's really going to change the way the country looks at this period. And he was a civil rights activist in his own right, called to speak before Congress during Nixon's impeachment, even during Clinton's impeachment, right before his death in 1999, I'm pretty sure. But just a huge figure in American academic and political life outside of what he wrote. He also encouraged debate, which I think is very important to Woodward because his work does kind of start Southern history the way we think about it today. It sets that study off. And so his students, push back against him sometimes or they add to him. I know that my work has definitely touched on Woodward's arguments that there's this difference between the Old South and the New South, which of course we'll get into shortly, I'm sure. But by allowing that debate, by allowing people to disagree with him, which not all scholars can do, I think we probably know that firsthand. Not all scholars can do that. It really was able to transform the field, and I think that part of his personality is important.
Yeah, I think that's true. And what's interesting is, so Marie hinted at this. I'll just put a little bit of meat on the bones here on the publication of this. It was part of a much broader series by LSU Press on the history of the South. Multi-volume series. There have been attempts to redo it. The only one that I know that was successful, it wasn't a multi-volume. It was like a series of essays. But this was sort of this big collection. The editor of the collection was a man named E. Merton Coulter, who taught for a while at the University of Georgia. And he is he's the last of the Dunningites. So for those of you who don't know, Marie, maybe you can give a bit, maybe it's worth, Marie, are you able to explain the Dunning School quickly?
Well, with Dunn and Phillips, you have this argument that the Civil War is fought over. I mean, it's the traditional lost cause narrative, right? The Civil War is fought for justifiable reasons, for Southern honor, that enslaved people were better off being enslaved than they were after they were freed. And then you have that picked up with Reconstruction, just arguing that Reconstruction was a horrible failure. That any problems that happened in the post-Reconstruction era were blamed on corrupt government officials. The planter elite was like this genteel class that only wanted the best for the South, is part of what they're arguing. And so, of course, Woodward is going to push back against this, but this is the narrative that Reconstruction was a huge failure. The planter elite, the redeemers, as they were called, these Southern Democrats who had been the genteel elite before the war, they want to return to a plantation agricultural society, and everything will be wonderful once that happens. So just the failure of Reconstruction, this kind of, now we look at it as this kind of perverted narrative of the Civil War.
Yeah, it comes out of the notion of, and Woodward talks about this in the book, and we'll get to it in a moment, of the era of of unification of the country. And there's this belief that the Civil War was some horrible accident almost, that it was started by radicals on both sides, and that and it wasn't really the genteel planter class that caused the Civil War in the South, and that then the North wildly overreached during Reconstruction in its attempt to restructure Southern society, and the governments were very corrupt and led by, and this is racially coded, but led by ignorant people, by which they mean the black people that often were in the state legislatures and had the vote. And these governments were treated as highly corrupt, and that it was only with the return of what they called home rule and the redeemers between 1872 and 1878 in the various states that good government returned to the South, smart government, thrifty government returned to the South. Anyway, that was the Dunning School, and E. Merton Coulter is sort of the last of those historians. Merton Coulter's at the University of Georgia, and he still teaches in that Dunningite tradition, and he writes two of the books in the History of the South series, including the one on Reconstruction. So Woodward's book actually comes right after the Merton Coulter's Reconstruction book. Anyway, so C. Vann Woodward is writing in 1951. Anyway, Marie, I think you may have struggled with the connection there for a second.
Yes, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Yes,
so I think I successfully filibustered through it.
Good,
Uh,
good, good.
so if you do hear either Marie or I going on a little too long sometimes, if it seems a little bit strange, it's because we are filibustering because there might be a connection problem on the other side. But anyway, I just sort of explained a little bit where E. Merton Coulter sat, and that when Woodward was, when they were initially looking for a scholar, and they did want a younger scholar to write this volume of the history of the South. Um, Woodward is eventually approached, and Merton Coulter's very skeptical about this young man who has some very liberal beliefs, but he's eventually convinced to allow him to write it. And again, there's some back and forth over its publication, but it is eventually published, and it is the classic of the collection, and it's the only one of the collection that I think is still particularly relevant. And of course, what's interesting is that Woodward is considered this great radical liberal in the 1930s and 1940s, and by 1969, he's sort of the stodgy conservative.
Right, right.
Or at the 1916,
Things change.
yeah, whereas at the 1969 AHA, Woodward and Eugene Genovese will be the forces of conservatism trying to stop the radical uprising of Howard Zinn and the
Right.
radical historians over the Vietnam War. What's the word I'm looking for? Statement. They wanted the AHA to make a statement condemning the Vietnam War, and C. Vann Woodward and Eugene Genovese did not want to do that. Anyway, so that's, I think, a little bit of history of C. Vann Woodward and where this book began. Marie, let me ask you, you hadn't read this book in a long time. What was your takeaway, having not read this in several years and rereading this?
Well, you and I talked about this a little bit, just how good of an author C. Vann Woodward was, which I know he was very influenced by other Southern authors like Faulkner, but just the prose, the kind of dry humor that he's got through this, the way that he can be both critical and sympathetic to some of the characters that he writes about, it's just a good read. Which, when you're going through comps, it doesn't seem like that, as you're slogging through this material, you've got so many books to read, but I had really forgotten what a just on its surface what a great read this is.
Absolutely. I've got a line here that I pulled out because I wanted to acknowledge his literary flourish. Um, he's referring to in the 1880s when the new South tries to recreate this lost cause narrative of the Old South and the virtues of the Old South, and he says, he's talking about this editor from Atlanta named Henry Grady. It says Jefferson Davis, hardly the most popular Confederate official, was resurrected from his plantation exile in 1886 by Henry Grady and borne in triumph up and down his old domain.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Right. I mean, and the book is, I mean, that's by no means the best example, but I was desperate to find I looked at 2 pages looking for the best one when I was trying to think of an example, and that was the best one I found. But that's just the best on those 2 pages.
Right, right. Oh,
The
it's
book
all
is full of that.
yes, yes.
And it's a reminder of, man, historians, we really used to be able to write, couldn't we?
We could, yes, yes. Which I think that we got a little dense over time. We got a little. I mean, not that Woodward isn't intellectual, but he's telling a story at the end of the day, and you can really see that narrative throughout the work and his other works. I mean, the Tom Watson biography, Strange Career of Jim Crow, the essays and Burden of Southern History. You see that throughout. I mean, he never loses that throughout his career.
Agreed. Yeah, he definitely does. All right, so Marie, let's start with this. What is just on the surface, what is Woodward talking about when he refers to the New South? Because again, there's going to be lots of people listening to this who might not be Southern historians.
Right. The time frame that he covers in the book, 1877, so compromise of 1877, end of Reconstruction to World War II, or World War One, excuse me. So 1918 is the time frame that he's looking at here. So 1877 to 1918.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, and it really kind of ends with 1913. It continues to 1918, but really the return of the or sorry, the return of the South was what I was going to say, but the that's the chapter title. By the way, his chapter titles alone are worth the read.
Yes, they
Um,
are. Yes, they are.
with the it really, the main thrust of the book really ends with the inauguration of Wilson,
Right.
which Woodward portrays as the return of the South to the heights of national power, because
Right.
Wilson, although he's from, he was governor of New Jersey, he's a Southerner by birth and by being, he was raised a Southerner, and he brings with him this group of very conservative Southern Democrats to staff his administration.
And Southern Democrats have seniority in Congress, so they're on all these important committees already. And so, with the presidency, with his advisors, and with Southerners in Congress, it really is this return of the South to federal power. And he does a great job building on that.
Yeah. And Woodward would argue that, and he argues in the book, and I mean that between 1861 and Wilson's inauguration, the South is very much on the outside of national power.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And so, okay, so Marie, what would you say is the biggest argument, or the biggest argument that Woodward is making?
I mean, one of the biggest arguments is this discontinuity thesis, where he's saying that the Old South is not the same as the New South. This lost cause narrative that it's just, the genteel planter class is only interrupted by the Civil War and this corrupt Reconstruction, and they reclaim power in agricultural plantation society. He's saying no. He's saying that after Reconstruction, this coalition forms. I mean, you have the planter elite, but you have businessmen, you have people who are beginning to industrialize the South. And you mentioned Grady earlier. He is traveling outside of the South making these speeches that are rallying people around saying, we're going back to the Old South, we're going back to the better days, even though he's an industrialist. He wants to bring money into the South. That's what he's looking for. But he's building on this idea that Americans, and especially Southerners, they want white Southerners specifically. Many want to go back to that idea of the Old South. And so by these politicians and these businessmen who are building on that, Woodward says they're creating this mythology that is just not borne out in the evidence. Like what he's looking at, it's just not there.
Right. That you're right. Yeah, I like that, the discontinuity thesis. I like that. I like the way you framed. I really like the way you framed that. That it's this idea that um, the generation that takes over after 1877, they have very different goals for the South than the antebellum South.
Yes.
However, they're going to use the mythology of the antebellum South in order to justify all of the radical changes they have in mind for Southern society.
Absolutely. And then he picks up on segregation, which for my work specifically has become the most important, that segregation was not inevitable. And I think this was probably such a bombshell in the 1950s, where you have these Southern politicians who are saying by the 1950s, segregation is the social system of the South. It's always been the social system of the South. And if you think just a little about the South, that doesn't make sense in the antebellum era. And Woodward, he does such an excellent job of talking about the sense that would have made for a slave society to be segregated. And then he talks about these examples of men like Tom Watson, who are these populist politicians pushing back against these redeemers, the Southern Democrats who are trying to reclaim control after Reconstruction, who create biracial coalitions. They're working with Black men to elect politicians, both Black and white. And it's when Southern Democrats begin this rollback of rights in the South to maintain and consolidate power that we see those coalitions break down. So showing it wasn't inevitable. It was a political strategy to maintain power. It wasn't something that was automatically going to happen. And I think that probably just shook the American. I just can imagine how much that shook the American South in the 1950s. And that's why King loved his work so much.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and Strange Career, it was a pocketbook of the civil rights movement in many ways.
Yes. Yeah, I think
Strange Career of Jim
he
Crow.
called it the Bible of the civil rights.
Right.
Yes.
So I think it's worth noting, and I think because I think if you're not a Southern historian, or maybe even if you are, but you're not a Southern historian of this period, um, I think there's this notion out there, Marie, that kind of with redemption in 1877, like Jim Crow begins on that day,
Right, right.
right? What does this book suggest about that?
It takes time. It doesn't begin in 1877. You have the populists after 1877. That's in this period that Woodward calls the New South. That, our listeners may be more familiar with the Gilded Age during this period, with what's happening in the industrial North. But the populists in these biracial coalitions come after Reconstruction ends. I mean, it takes until the 1880s in some places, even the 1890s in others. And it doesn't happen all at once. It depends on the political ideology in these states. It depends on the coalitions being built in these states. But it's not 1877 Jim Crow. That it's so much more nuanced than
Right.
previously taught.
And we're going to get into the ironies here in a few minutes, I think, because this book, like all good Southern histories, it's riddled with irony.
Yeah.
But a thing that I forgot until I read this, just on the history, before we get into the historiography, I'm going to talk about the one thing that I forgot about the history here for a second, is that all of the state Jim Crow constitutions that begin with Mississippi in 1890, I think, and then kind of continue through 1905, depending on what state you were in. The only one that was submitted to a popular vote, which was like the vote that was supposed to be taken if you're making a constitutional amendment, the only one that was submitted to a popular vote was in Alabama. Every other ones were just declared.
Right. Right.
And why were they? And they were just declared because they couldn't trust the populist voters to vote for them.
Exactly.
I mean, not to mention the black voters, but like,
alone.
pardon me?
That proves his thesis alone, that they couldn't trust the voters to pass these measures, to pass Jim Crow. So they knew at the time, this is not cut and dry.
Right. Right. And so the notion that somehow segregation was a legacy, was somehow endemic to Southern society just falls apart on its face, as you said, Marie. I mean, it's just it made no sense. It only made sense for 40 years to make that argument. Right. And even then, I think, you start, and this book doesn't cover that period, but you start looking at the 1920s and 1930s, and again, it becomes a lot more complicated.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Okay. Anyway, so we've talked a little bit about the book. What are some of the other arguments that the book makes, aside from maybe segregation? Because it talks about a lot of things.
Right. And there's an economic analysis within like this economic undercurrent throughout his work. So that these industrial capitalists are transforming the South during Reconstruction, and that's going to continue in the post-Reconstruction era, where they were vilified as corrupt during Reconstruction itself. They're still in charge. They're still continuing. They're just trying to push the populists and push black voters out of the electorate. So this idea that the industrialists are continuing, and this leads to things in the South like the convict lease system, which he spends time talking about in here, which obviously drastically affects black men more than white men, poor Southerners more than wealthy Southerners. And so when pulling that out, like the different structures in society, all with under this economic umbrella, he's able to make that not just political argument, but that economic argument as well, kind of bursting this bubble of previous history.
Right. And I think it's worth noting, like Woodward is not talking necessarily about Reconstruction in this book. And so he doesn't really criticize the I think the pre-existing or the prevailing narrative which would have existed when he was writing this book, that Reconstruction was a period of very corrupt governments. He's not arguing against that. He kind of, I think, generally accepts that.
Right.
But what he says maybe it wasn't as corrupt as you think, but he doesn't really attack that, which I think is actually smart if you're writing a book like this. Like that's a fight he badly didn't need to fight.
Right.
Because the
Right.
battle he's fighting, as he says, the Redeemer governments that followed were just as corrupt, if
Yes.
not
Yes.
more corrupt.
Right. It's this through line is what he's showing. That it doesn't just end because Reconstruction is over. Right.
And I mean, I think, the convict lease system is, it really, I don't know that even to this day that I've read a book that is as damning of the convict lease system as Woodward is.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And one of the things I didn't realize is that a guy who figures prominently in some of my own work is John Bankhead in Alabama, and I didn't realize that his father, or maybe it was his grandfather, actually made his fortune on the convict through the convict lease system,
Oh wow.
and that's in this book here.
Well, that helped your own work too.
Right. Oh, I mean, yeah. So it's anyway. Lots of interesting stuff on that. What do you think, Marie? How does and this I think would be very different from maybe today's literature. How does he treat the North?
Well, and it's like this economically, it's this colonial mercantilist system where we're taking the South's raw material and sending them north. And so these politicians and these industrialists are very connected to the Northern economy, even as you're trying to close society off in this Jim Crow. And so it's this kind of it's advantageous for the industrialists and for the politicians and the businessmen who want power, but it's not. This relationship is detrimental to the majority of Southerners in this agricultural society.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about this. Woodward is generally considered a Southern liberal, right? But the adjective matters, not just the noun.
Exactly. Yes.
He's still a
Yes.
Southerner.
Yes, he is, and he is writing about his home.
Yeah. And he is very critical, incredibly critical of the Northeast. The only group that might be a bigger boogeyman to Woodward than the Redeemers are Northeastern conservatives.
Right, right. And in a way, they're letting it happen, right? They're encouraging the redeemers in the post Reconstruction era to create this society that harms the majority of Southerners. And so I think, yeah, I mean, he is, and he lives in the Northeast at this point. He can be critical, and they still, the Northeasterners at the time still love the book.
Yeah, I don't know how. I'd be really curious. I'd love to have a group of modern, like you and I are doing this right now, but I'd love to have maybe a broader section of historians because we're sort of based in the South typically, so we maybe have a different perception of some of these things. But I'd love to sit in like in a room at Harvard or Columbia or Princeton and have them and see what they think of this book
Yes,
because
yes,
there is sort of this, I think, unfortunate kind of narrative among Northern histories of the period that that the North is good. I'm oversimplifying here, but make the North seem a little bit more benevolent than maybe it was. And
yeah,
Woodward
yes,
takes that to task.
yes, he does. Just like we have a lost cause theory in the South, or myth in the South, they have a free North myth in the Northeast still today. Northern students, my colleague teaches at a small school in New York. Her Northern students do not want to hear that there was slavery in the North for far longer than they realized, or that the reason there's not segregation is that formerly enslaved people are pushed out of the North. And so they're just not represented. They're not there in the same way. They don't want to hear it.
Right,
And
right.
so I do think it would be very interesting to see what Northeastern intellectuals think about Woodward.
Anyway, but so Woodward sets up. Let's talk about the politics for a second. We do want to make sure that we highlight that because you're right. There's this great social, cultural, and economic analysis. It's a great book for that reason because it's everything, right? But Woodward sets up this notion that Southerners had a choice in the wake of redemption to ally with the West or to ally with the Northeast. Marie, are you able to go in a little bit of detail into what that distinction or what those alternatives meant? But so that Southerners, the Southern electorate coming out in the New South period had a choice whether to ally with the West or to ally with the Northeast, right? And that's a theme that keeps coming through this book, right? Is it's a constant. There's this back and forth, right?
Right.
And there's forces in the South that want to ally with the West, and there's forces in the South that want to ally with the Northeast. Are you able to? Can you maybe explain a little bit of what those alternatives were?
And you're asking like why they would ally with the West versus the Northeast.
Or I mean, Woodward has a preference,
Right.
but what those alternatives to Woodward meant. There's this choice of the left fork or the right fork, is how he describes it. That Southerners had a choice as to whether to go with the Western populist movements or to ally with the Northeastern conservative movement. Probably the most acute moment for that decision was the 1896 election. Southerners, who had a large control over the Democratic Party, there were many Southerners who thought that they should follow the way of the populists, men like William Jennings Bryan, and those who wanted to ally with Northeasterners. In fact, it goes earlier than the 1896 election. The only time that the Democrats held power in the New South in the period under study until Wilson's inauguration was during Cleveland's two administrations. And Cleveland represents this Northeastern conservative gold Democrat perspective. And there were many Southerners, many of who, according to Woodward, were in the Redeemer tradition, sometimes referred to as the Bourbon tradition. Men who were these sort of proto-industrialists or wanted to industrialize the South. These were the men connected to railroads, connected to mutual life insurance companies, to mining, to steel, to emerging manufacturing. And some of the key journalists in the South, men like Henry Grady, and they wanted a Southern Democratic Party that was very friendly to Northeastern capital, because that's how they saw economic development and economic recovery looking. And so that group desperately wanted to ally with, you might call them the Cleveland Northeastern Democrats. Whereas those who tended to more be farmers, tended to be more clearly connected to the agrarian economy, at least according to Woodward, wanted to ally with the Westerners who opposed this Gilded Age industrial Clevelandite system of hard money, very little government spending, and and they wanted the more populist message. So that was my filibustering and trying to allow Marie to go check out the alarms. First of all, are the alarms? Is anybody coming after you?
No, and I did ask my colleague next door, and we both shrugged. We haven't gotten emails, so hopefully, I won't have to run away soon. I think it may be in the larger city of Conway, so we're gonna continue on.
Okay, so Marie, I don't know if you were able to hear anything of what I just said, but how would you characterize the choice between Southern Democrats choosing to ally with the Northeast versus those who wanted to ally with the West?
I do think you explained it very well, the industrialist versus the agrarianist, basically. And I think that Woodward having this moment between the early 40s and the early 50s of to write the book is really helpful because the Dixiecrats in 48 are doing the same thing. They're trying to figure out, do we draw support from the West or do our colleagues look to the Northeast? And so I think he sees that happening in real time, and he can look back and he can see this in this New South era, the same types of push and pull here. And of course, the Dixiecrats have a lot more success with Westerners than they do in the Northeast, largely because of their segregationist policies. But I think in the post, like this new South era, there really is this opportunity to become more industrialized versus return to this agrarian state. And so it's this kind of argument that Woodward follows throughout the text.
What's Woodward's preference?
Oh, I think it depends. Um, I would definitely say that bringing industry in Woodward thought was important.
Yeah, but I mean, I definitely, I think he likes the West better than he likes the Northeast.
Yeah, I mean, the corruption in the Northeast is certainly a problem for Woodward.
And he also, I mean, he is an Arkansan.
And we consider sometimes some Arkansans consider themselves Westerners more than they do Southerners, although I would disagree.
Yeah, well,
I think from my own lived experience, I would disagree.
That's probably, it's the South with some Western characteristic.
Exactly. It depends on where you are in Arkansas.
Sure, but I do think the Southwest is very different from the Southeast, and
Yes,
I think it gives you a different, and I do think it gives you a different perspective on things. And him being an Arkansan, had he been from, Savannah, he might have had a very different preference.
And the populists are more popular in the West as well. And they're forming these coalitions in the West as well. And that's where he sees the opportunity in the South for real change, is in those populist movements. And so that connection is also very important to him.
Yeah, I mean, the populists, as Woodward describes, are more, they develop in Texas and then Arkansas, right? And you've got the biracial coalitions initially beginning in places like Texas and Arkansas. And anyway, I do think, the politics of the one of the main themes of the politics is this choice that Southerners have on the national level. Are they going to ally with the West, or are they going to ally with the Northeast? And there's a wing of the party, the Redeemer wing of the party is very partisan towards allying with the Northeast. And the more agrarian wing of the party is the champions of allying with the West.
Right.
And we've talked a little bit about the populists. How the populists, I think, are at the center of this book.
Yeah. Yeah. And the biography of Tom Watson, which is his first major work, I mean, that's what he looks at. So his mind's already there when he's picking up Origins. And he uses, I mean, Tom Watson definitely takes a back seat in Origins, and he's got these other examples, but you can see that same argument where that's where the opportunity is. That's where it becomes like the discontinuity thesis lies in that there was this alternative. And they didn't live up to it. The Redeemers shut it down.
Right. And he very much, he criticizes the agrarians and the populists too, but he blames much of the South's ills on the Redeemers.
Yes. Yes. The exact opposite of what we saw before in the research, where it's the Redeemer. I mean, they're called the Redeemers. They've saved the South. They've redeemed the South. And he says, no, they are the problem. They are the issue here. And he does an excellent job making that argument.
Right. Yeah. So what's your favorite chapter?
Oh, would I have to choose? I like how he wraps the book up. I really do appreciate how, like, he does tie everything together well. Again, you could choose any chapter, any page, and you would find his writing beautiful. But the way he ties it all together, and he lays out this argument there at the very end, I think, which I know the end is, you're happy to be at the end during comps for many reasons at that point, but I do like how he ties the book together.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. And the name of that chapter, I'm just going to, is Return of the South, I think, right? That's the final, or is it so, Bonds of Mind and Spirit? Yeah. No, Return of the South. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that really looks at what it's like for when the Wilson, or the Wilson, what it looks like with Wilson in power, and with the Southern Redeemers now, or the next generation of Redeemers back in power in Washington.
Exactly. And he's shown that throughout. He's built that up throughout the text. And you see it, and it's, I mean, they've won. They got back into federal power. I mean, Wilson, like you said, is a Southerner with Southern sympathies, even though he'd been out of the South. He took the opposite approach that Woodward took. When he's looking in, he liked what he saw, where Woodward is criticizing what he saw. And I just think that building on that and ending with Wilson, it just ties it all together. And it shows you not only did they win at the state level, they got the federal government back, and they kept it for a long time.
Yeah. So it's this, it's this, conservative triumph and a Southern conservative triumph, which I think actually goes against how I think most people understand Wilson, because I think most people see him as this arch progressive, right? But Woodward does not see him as an arch progressive. Or if he, actually, I should rephrase. How does Woodward, maybe this is better, how does Woodward see progressivism?
He sees there's limits. It's better for white people than it is for black people across the country in total. It's a political tool for many of the politicians who engage in progressive measures. It's a way to, I mean, when Wilson is running, they're all progressives, right? It's already to a point at the federal level where even if you're not as progressive as your opponent, the country has said, okay, we like progressivism in some way. And what Woodward does well is he says, here's the limits on this. Like we've learned this as, these good things, maybe some people think government overreach, but there's these good things that people think are good that have happened. But they've benefited white Americans. They've, in many cases, hurt Black Americans, or at least not helped Black Americans. And that is certainly true in the South. And so, even though like progressivism means different things to different politicians, and they use these terms differently to attract voters, but attracting those populists by using progressive language and these promises of reform is very beneficial in breaking up those coalitions. And I think he does a good job showing that throughout.
Yeah, I think he does. I mean, I think he definitely, well, I think that's really well explained. And what do you think the relationship is to Woodward between progressivism and conservatism?
Will you expand on that just
Yeah, I mean, because the people who are the progressives under, who are the progressives under Wilson 8 years ago, in the 1904 election, national election, were championing conservative, like, what Woodward would have considered very conservative ideas. The people are the same, right? It's not like it's a different generation of people that have come. It's they seem to have found a way to accommodate their old conservative beliefs into this new era for progressivism.
And if you can have a more racialized progressivism, it's not that far removed from that earlier conservatism. You're not having to make these intellectual leaps and bounds to justify your action. And the politicians don't change, but the voters do begin to expect more from politicians, which pushes those, if nothing else, rhetorical changes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think it's this notion of there's this patrician noblesse oblige, right? That the conservatives can use as sort of their, okay, we're going to be progressives as patrician noblesse oblige. Men like Furnifold Simmons, or it wouldn't have been hard to imagine Wade Hampton, frankly, as a progressive 40 years later, right? The race thing might have been difficult for Hampton, well, it wouldn't have been, but, Hampton uses his, and Woodward talks a lot about this, that the early Redeemers are often better on race than, and this is some of the irony, right? So that the earlier Redeemers are sometimes better on race than the populists who follow, than some of the populists who follow.
Right. As
Yet
that
some of the
changes.
populists will set up biracial coalitions, and it's so complicated.
Right. That's what he does. That's what he does so well, is he lays out this nuance. He just complicates the narrative so much, and then he allows other scholars to kind of drag that out.
I'm going to pivot here to maybe a couple of questions that we can start asking of every book think might be interesting. Are there any claims that you think Woodward goes way too far with?
I think he overstates he never says racial equality, but the biracial nature of these populist coalitions. And I think he did get some pushback from that, if not in real time, soon after the book was released. I think he's making a good point, and some of it has to be overstated for him to make that point clearly. But I do think he overstates some of that. The populists are working more, they're more opportunistic than Woodward sometimes explains. Not that he leaves that out, but I do think he's trying to make this argument about the opportunity of a biracial Southern society. And so I think that's the big thing that, like, my reading of the text is that's the biggest thing that he kind of overdoes there.
Yeah, I think that's really that's a good point. I hadn't actually thought of that one, but yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That's a really good point. The one that I would think of is um, he kind of sometimes it feels like there's a conspiracy of the Northeast against the South,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I think he goes a little too far with that
Yes.
sometimes.
Yes, he's pushing back against the ideology of this free North, right? He's pushing back against his colleagues that he's seeing in the North who are making this argument. He's like, no, that's not borne out in the evidence. So yes, again, it's almost like he has to for this first work, and then we can see critics and those who respond to Woodward kind of roll that back just a bit. But the fact that it's in there is important.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
absolutely, yeah.
yeah, and the notion, and I mean, he's very upfront about this. The notion is that it's an imperial economy, and the South is a colony of the Northeast throughout
Right,
this period.
right,
And the Redeemers are sort of set up as colonial elites
right, right. Which is
that are
exactly
in
where they were
alliance with the Northeast government. And it goes, again, it might go a little too far in a few places. But you're right. I mean,
right.
I think he exaggerates the proof to overturn existing. He's being provocative, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Um,
Which you needed to do.
which he needed to do. Okay, how do you think this book compares to some of the other Woodward books? You mentioned a couple of them earlier: "Strange Career" and "Problems: Burden of Southern History," being the more
I
iconic one.
think I think he's constantly responding to himself. I think that, Strange Careers, Burden of Southern History, especially, I mean, he's responding to his entire body of work in that. I mean, what a wonderful text there. But
Yeah,
I think, he's drawing out a chapter from Origins to create Strange Career of Jim Crow. He's building on that constantly, and that's part of the evolution that we see, not just with those who respond to him, not just with his students, but with himself. And so I think that they all fit so nicely together. Even the Tom Watson biography, which is definitely, it's different than his other work. It's his early work. We all have that, that first book. It's good, but his main argument gets completely overshadowed in that work. I think he really is able to make his points in his later work. And I mean, he's responding to himself.
yeah, I think that's a really good point. He's responding to himself, and you're right. About his Tom Watson biography, and that I mean, I do think that sets the tone for his entire career in the sense that he is a champion of early Tom Watson, not late Tom Watson.
No, 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 no. And there
Um,
is a big difference.
yeah, and early Tom Watson is very much a champion of one of the foremost champions, I think, of biracial democracy in the South in the 1880s and 1890s, particularly the 1890s. But then he goes away after really with the Spanish War. He kind of disappears from the arena and comes back reinvented 10 years later as an arch segregationist.
Yes. Yes. I mean, you would think it's two different people. I mean, just the opportunistic side of him seems to have appeared. Like he has been changed by his society by the time he reappears in his later political career.
One of the things that I wasn't really gonna bring up, but I think it's interesting, is that just by mentioning kind of Tom Watson's disappearance, the period between 1898 and 1906 might be the most viciously racist period in Southern history.
Yeah, I think there's an argument to be made for that. I mean, that they're solidifying their control. Jim Crow is new. Disfranchisement is relatively new in these places, and they enforce it. And they passed these laws, and now you have this just, yeah, virulent racism, just violent racism to keep that status quo so people don't push back against it.
Well, yeah, and Woodward would argue because this is the next generation of redeemers who become the
Yes,
progressives, frankly, who are solidifying their absolute control of the South, and that, and this is Woodward's, broader argument over several works, but this is about keeping the populace down.
exactly. No more biracial coalitions.
Right. And they kind of there's sort of this notion among the redeemers that the the that the possibility of black voters is a threat to the society they're trying to establish.
Yes, exactly. A threat to their power.
Right. And the populace kind of enthusiastically agree
Eventually, yes, they do.
for weird reasons. I don't want to go on too much longer because it is, it's Woodward, and you and I are Southern historians, so there's, we can go on permanently on it. But I do want to kind of highlight some of the ironies that Woodward brings out in this, and a lot of them, of course, deal with race, and that the populists, who are the ones who actually do attempt to set up biracial coalitions in this period, are frequently the most hostile to black voters.
It's where they find opportunity.
Yeah, I love how you phrase that, opportunism. And I think that's at the forefront of this work, is that the redeemers are wildly opportunistic, and so are the populists.
Yes, yes.
And it's this battle for control of the South between the redeemers and the populists, and they are both viciously opportunistic.
Yes, yeah. If it benefits them to engage with black voters and to try to get black voters on their side, they do it. If it doesn't, they don't.
I mean, I think it's probably best encapsulated by Marion Butler in North Carolina, where you've got this populist leader who his main goal is to destroy the redeemers, right, in North Carolina. And at the state level, he's allied with the Republicans in order to overthrow the Redeemer power in Raleigh. And actually and there's a lot of, again, it goes a lot of reasons for that, like local controls taken away from towns and is basically brought in North Carolina to the state capital so that the Redeemers have full control of everything. And so Butler's are allied with the Republicans at the state level against that. Yet it's also the 1896 election. And at the national level, he's allied with Bryan and the National Democrats against the National Republicans.
Right.
Who he believes are the allies of the Democrat Redeemers in Raleigh.
Right.
So it's good luck following this.
Yes.
I mean, it's
and it shows how this language is different depending on time and place. Democrat, Republican, like those things, even, in the later literature we'll talk about, it does mean something different in certain times and places. And I do think that's a great example of that, because, the Republicans and the Democrats at the national level are doing something for this person, this party in North Carolina. And we're seeing this ideology develop in real time with this. These coalitions are forming and breaking apart, and he's tracing that.
Yeah. And I think, if nothing else, what Woodward does, whether you buy anything else that's in his book, what I think he really does shatter is any notion of a solid South.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. It may be called the same party. It is not. Those primary elections can be vicious.
Right. And the primaries that really emerge in that highly racist period that we were talking about, the whole period is racist, let's be real, but there's an acute sense of extremeness, the kind of 1898 through 1906. That's where the primary really emerges, and that becomes the real election.
Right, exactly.
But the one thing that the populists get in that is the primary. So they will be they'll be able to contest the nomination, at least. But there will still be no shortage of cheating.
Especially during that time period, the 1890s. You've got to cheat to get in power, pass laws to stay in power, use the violence to maintain the power. And that's that evolution where the populists, I mean, they stay, under the umbrella of the Democratic Party, but that's where we see them, really get that power, and then those coalitions break apart when the Democrats start to acknowledge, okay, white populists want these things, we're going to throw them a bone so they can be as racist as they want to be and no longer feel that they need to form these coalitions.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I mean, we're talking, I'm going to counterfactual here for a second, but that at least in Woodward's narrative here, the way that he explains it, if Bryan doesn't win the nomination in 1896 of the Democratic Party, if the Democratic Party still was held to the control of the Clevelandites, right? Maybe there is no one-party system in the South.
That definitely would have caused a rift. That would have started a big political fight. absolutely.
I mean, I think that would have kept the People's Party alive.
It may have, yes, in opposition to the Clevelandites.
Right. I mean, I think there's this, again, and I think there's this great political cartoon, probably a Thomas Nast political cartoon at the time, where it's, Bryan is the big snake eating the Democratic Party, eating the mule, right?
Yes.
And so there's this idea that the populists have captured the Democratic Party. But I think the way that Woodward shows it is that no, they let themselves be captured, in the South at least.
It benefited them.
Because it kept them in the tent. And
such an excellent point. If Bryan didn't win that primary, it's got my wheels turning. That's an excellent point.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far into being counterfactuals here, but it just the notion kind of it leapt to mind as I was reading this, like, oh, again, they let themselves be captured to some degree. And that nipped the major opposition in the bud.
Yes, it did.
And it allowed them to, okay, we're going to take a PAC seat in the Democratic Party for a couple of years.
Long enough.
Just long enough, yeah. And it will keep us in power at the state level.
Right. And it did.
Yeah. And there's a few people, obviously, the Populist Party that wasn't good enough for. Maybe they ran with Bryan in '96, but they didn't like where the party was going, so they split off and some formed some socialist parties and small groups and that kind of thing. But it never. But after that part, they were basically under the control of the Democrats.
It doesn't last long at that point.
Yeah. Anyway, so all right, last question here. If you were to if this was a comps list and you were setting it up and you wanted to have the book that followed Woodward, what's the next logical book?
I should have thought of that a little bit more. What's your opinion on the most logical book for next?
I mean,
Let me throw back that question.
Yeah, sure. That's a good idea. That's good. That's exceptional. You're going to make a great politician one day. The one that leaps to mind is Ed Ayers' Promise of the New South.
Okay, yeah. Ayers would be good next.
I think that's probably the next major response to Woodward.
Right.
But I haven't read it in so long. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. Maybe some of the work on, maybe the answer is Link, Southern Progressivism.
That would definitely pick up on it, yeah. And, depending on which directions your comps take, Link would probably be good.
And I'm drawing a blank on his name. The other writer on Southern Progressivism, the other historian of Southern Progressivism.
See, I have some.
Yeah, Dewey Grantham. That's the other guy, Dewey Grantham. How about yourself? And now that I've given a couple of ideas, where would you go?
Yeah, I think a book in response to his would maybe a good place to go next. Genovese Stamp might be good examples there. I like where you went with it. And then, of course, we build on it later with Stephen Hahn and his other students who push back against or expand, really. I mean, they don't necessarily disagree with his main thesis. They just think voices are missing. And so you've got to go there eventually. Like you've got to eventually on a comps list like this, you've got to read Stephen Hahn.
Or Glenda Gilmore?
Glenda Gilmore, absolutely, absolutely. Adding those, I mean, that's one thing. I know we don't have time to talk about that today, but the voices who are missing is a big part of this. You know, you don't talk about women, very little from actual Southern Black Americans is there. Part of that's sourcing. I mean, part of that's beyond his control. But adding Gilmore, who builds on that, adds those voices in. Excellent. Yeah.
Do you think Woodward's thesis still holds up? His perception of this period still holds up? Do historians still generally agree with it, or have they successfully overturned it?
I mean, it's the foundation. I don't think it's been overturned. It's been expanded on. It's been argued. It's been responded to since he wrote it in 51. But I think that, I mean, and the cultural turn changes some of that, of course. But I think at its basis, it's still there. It still holds up.
I agree. I don't think it's been overturned. I think it's, as you said, it's been expanded on and refined and responded to, but I don't think the foundation has been overturned at all. Nobody has done to Woodward what Woodward did to that earlier group of historians with this.
Absolutely agree with that. He overturned those previous schools. He is the pinnacle of Southern history.
Yeah, I think that's fair. For those of you who are interested, James Cobb just published a biography on C. Vann Woodward a couple of years ago.
Yes,
so
it's excellent.
If you're interested in Woodward's research, his scholarship, Woodward the man, I highly recommend. Any work by Jim Cobb, but that one particularly.
Yes, he called him the Southern Renaissance man.
I like that.
Yeah, I do too.
I like that. Okay, Marie, any last things we want to talk about?
I think we've covered most of it. I'm glad we started with Woodward. I think this was an excellent place to start.
So am I. All right. Well, for those of you who've stuck with us for the full hour, thank you very much. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks with the next book. All right. Thank you, Marie.
Thank you. Bye.